at you.
Hello?
Oh, hey, shut up. I'm just starting.
And take it away, RJ.
Yes, thank you, Mel. A little bit of a bumpy ride here on there, but I'm amazed that any of this works. So, given all the technology and stuff, we wing it. And compared to like the Black Death and the asteroid impact 65 million years ago, it's relatively trivial. So we can proceed. Welcome to our latest installment of Evolution Hour. Jackson is here. We have a friend Sean. We have somewhere far down the line, Tornado Pelt, who will perhaps be tornadoing, as the case may be. Everybody that's got a view of the live chat, keep an eye out for questions and comments and such like that, because the old RJ can get kind of focused on stuff. And I'm continuing with the evil project that Jackson and I have for the assembling the material for volume 2 of Rocks, which should be about as massive as volume 1 after we're all through with all of the material that's coming in. Particularly, we're making a point of bringing in material that's been arriving that's relevant to the work that's appeared in the time since we did the work. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that relates to Kent Hovind, and there's a long series of stupid from ICR of a series of articles that they put up that supposedly absolutely essential reading to disprove evolution and support design, and it's basically a pile up of gee whiz arguments. For those who haven't read the Rocks were there, we use the phrase gee whiz to describe any argument that basically says, well, gosh, that's complicated. That must be designed. That must be created. Not necessarily.
Well, speaking of design,
yeah,
I encountered someone who absolutely refuses to get the information that I was presenting. As in, I said, hey, listen, we got this evidence of X, Y, and Z of why chimpanzees and humans are not separately created kinds, and they just didn't want to hear it.
Well, that's true. Erica was having a debate with a fog bank called Smokey on Modern Day Debate. Just before I got over here, I was able to catch like the first half hour of it. Essentially, it's all a negative argument. They were supposedly talking about human evolution. And along the way, the last I heard before I had to bug out was Smokey wondering whether or not, well, why couldn't Neanderthals have evolved from human beings? At which point I would go, the chronology right off the bat, because they were around for literally hundreds of thousands of years before humans arrived on the scene. Oh, Lisa in the live chat says, do they ever cite something from this century? Actually, yes. Part of my TIP project is to keep track of the source citation base. And in fact, anti-evolutionists overall have cited upwards of 5,000 technical papers, all from like the 1960s on. And they cite material from the current century. All of this claptrap in those latest ICR articles are riffing off of material that's just like brand new. And in fact, that's part of the kind of hair trigger approach that you get with an awful lot of apologetics, both at the Discovery Institute and at AIG and ICR. It's some new paper comes along and there's a discussion of it at Science Daily or archive.org or various other secondary comments. And they riff off of that to say, wow, isn't this wonderful and complicated? And the evolutionists can't explain that. They don't have an explanation for this, without them actually offering their explanation for it. That's what was amusing about watching what little I could of Smokey's discussion with Erica, since primate evolution and that is her thing. You would hope, at one point Smokey was saying, he was comparing all the different models. And I would have liked to have jumped in, and where is the anti-evolution model? All the models they're talking about are the evolutionary ones that are competing notions about what was related to what and which branched off from what in what order. And there's actually pretty much overall consensus about human evolution. All you get issues is how you classify nodes and which one is the closest cousin or not at certain nodes. But absolutely no one I know is arguing that it's not basically basal hominids, and then you've got Australopithecines, and then from that you're eventually getting some Homo habilis or cousin, and then you're getting Homo erectus, and then some cousin or group like Rudolfensis or whatever into human beings about 300,000 years ago. And that picture hasn't changed in like decades, because that overall picture is accurate. It's just a matter of finding the new little blips on the scope. Well, where's the intelligent design model? That he, by the way, is Smokey is ambivalent about the age of the Earth. He kind of leans towards old Earth, but he is aware. Well, you realize this is not like an example of between whether or not you think something took place in 1200 BCE or 1250 BCE. This is a difference between events taking place like 4,500 years ago and 300,000 years ago. This is a way bigger divide going on in here. And the fact that there's no clear map of time issue, independent of how Neanderthals and humans got on the scene, it's an objective observation that Neanderthals got here before we did. And they have their distribution and they have all of the things that are going on, and you have the data field. Plus we have the genetics and all of that. I don't know whether or not Erica was probing what kind of source base Smokey was relying on or not. But anyway, I digress, which of course you may have noticed I have a terrible tendency to do. Anyway, the main subject of part one is our ongoing analysis of replacing Darwin, which is good old Nathaniel Jensen's attempt to dislodge conventional evolution. It's a book that Dan Cardinale is now diving into in considerable detail and all the rest. So it's getting a lot of.
Hold on, let me see if I can sum it up in a few words. Oh, this can't possibly be due to evolution. It has to be created.
Oh, and not merely created, recently created. That's going to be the upshot of his main argument. It'll be a while before he gets to it in the later chapters, but the bulk of the remainder of the book is a series of assertions that critters have not merely been created, but an awful lot of speciation events has been taking place since the flood 4,500 years ago. And that, of course,
despite the fact that that would require multiple nuclear bombs of energy per square
kilometer.
He
doesn't bother about those fiddly little details. Anyway, the problem is, I'll address this in part to Sean, because the fact that what puzzled me about this book, when you look at it, and the reason why I put this on the list for the next one to analyze in details, is if you want to find out what's in it, there's no index. There's no reference bibliography to see what he cited. It's all a matter of going page by page, looking up the notes at the end of the book, connecting that up with the information in there. It is intelligently designed to be as difficult to use as possible, which is always a dead giveaway. Anyway, he finally
like living organisms.
Yeah, he's beginning to tiptoe into some more dangerous turf. And here he gets into, he cited a mouse genome paper from the early 2000s, which explicitly supports the idea of junk DNA. He doesn't mention that part. So I put the link, the ResearchGate up to link on this. And does he really want to bring that up? But this relates in turn to another topic, which are gene deserts, which is the idea that there are little blobs of DNA that are kind of devoid of functional genes, that there are areas that are like little icebergs of isolation that have occurred because of lineage splittings and all this. And so did he really want to bring up the stuff he was citing? So one of the ones, a lot of it was very old material, but one of them, which was relating, I put up a science blog link to it, as well as to the actual paper, this Hillier one. The material involving genome, gene deserts in primates and apes directly supports the chromosome 2 fusion. Did he really want to bring this topic up? And then he went on to homeobox genes. Finally, I've been waiting for that shoe to drop. He references a lot of very old material that was basically when they were first starting to get into this. Anybody that reads old Jonathan Wells will remember his diatribe about antennapedia in the Icons of Evolution book. And that was one of the very first ones that was discovered that eventually fed into the homeobox gene. Well,
what does he say about it?
Well, not much. He is simply alluding to the fact that people were discovering these things. So he cites a bunch of papers from the 1980s, of which most weren't available open access, but this one from Fisher 1986 was, so I put the link up to that so you can actually follow up on it. I put linkages to a couple summary papers that get us up to speed about where the actual field was. There's one from 2006, which of course predates Jensen's book, so he could have cited one of that instead of all of this little side material by Maeda and Karch, which went into a lot of beautiful detail about how they were building up this notion that the homeoboxes functioned like little connector block modules, and that they would connect up another one and another one and another one, and they would come in layers, and some of them would continue functioning, and the new ones would kick in like a series of railroad trains coming along inside things, and the regulation of those genes would produce amazing complexity because of the same little modules connecting up in nested hierarchies, which have been modified over time. They first were discovering this with Drosophila because it's an easy bug to look at, and they were able to get the genomes effectively. But the big shoe that dropped, and he hasn't yet really addressed the implications of it, is the moment when it dawned on them, wait a minute, this looks like a thing we found in vertebrates. That the same subcomponent genes are showing up over on our side of the fact. And remember, this is protostome versus deuterostome. This is really diverged groups. So that's when it was coming up by the 1990s on, it was becoming increasingly the case that there was an underlying architecture to that body plan stuff. That it's not that a bug has a totally different genetics to make bug body compared to us. It has a shuffleboarded version of the same little building blocks that end up making bug body versus us. And the fact that this is occurring in such two widely different lineages means this is a really deep divide in the genetic argument.
And it's also occurring to a lesser extent in the organisms more closely related to arthropods. When you compare the velvet worms and the tardigrades against the arthropods, you realize how very similar genetically they are to each other, even though they're different
Terns
phyla.
begin to emerge.
Right. It was in Darwin's Doubt where Meyer, he also brings up antennapedia probably as a result of Wells, and really just says all Hox genes are just switches. They can't contribute to evolution, except he doesn't bother at all to look at any phylogenies using Hox genes.
Yeah.
So it's like he says Hox genes exist by, and that's pretty much it. So.
Yeah, and that this is used just as kind of a shibboleth. Meanwhile, the research has gone on. So I brought up another paper that by happenstance happened to be just the year after Jensen's book, 2018, HOX Genes, Clusters and Collinearity by Rob Krumloff. And he went into basically summarizing where the field was in 2018, which is like light years ahead of the version that you're getting in Jensen's book from 2017. So I'll quote a little bit from it, and I got the whole link up on it. It says, the idea that combinations of HOX proteins provide a code for specifying regional identities has been validated by genetic gain and loss of function experiments in a wide variety of organisms. Yet this raises the question of whether such protein in the combinatorial code has a unique role contribution, or are they interchangeable? The ability to generate targeted mutations and knock in gene variants into the mouse germline provided a powerful opportunity to explore these kinds of questions. This led to a flood of sophisticated genetic analyses of genes in the HOX clusters and provided numerous examples of redundancy in a variety of tissue contexts among HOX genes within a paralog group and between different paralog groups. And he lists off a whole slew of papers on there.
Hold on, RJ, you missed an obvious pun there. It led to a flood of new information.
And none of this work, none of it is done by any anti-evolutionists. Not a single intelligent design author, not a single young earth creationist geneticist has contributed a detailed framework that's anywhere near as detailed, as informative as what's going on in there. And then later on in the same paragraph, Krumhoff went on, swaps and replacements between homeodomains also raise questions about the degree of specificity of HOX proteins, and in some cases showed remarkable plasticity in the ability for HOX proteins to functionally compensate for each other. This implies that in many contexts, it may not be the gene protein itself that is important, but how it is regulated and the total dose of HOX proteins. The principles uncovered from these findings have been generally applicable to many genes and have helped to uncover cases for redundancy, subfunctionalization, and acquisition of novel activities of duplicated genes.
Yes.
Meanwhile, it's fluffy land over in the HOX. To get some perspective, Jackson is a young pup who wouldn't come from a period that had such a ton of bricks quality as when HOX genes were discovered. When I was first diving in seriously into the evolution issue in the 80s on, and then eventually started to generate the work that eventually led to my TIP project in the 1990s, that's when homeobox genes were really being discovered. And it was such an epochal moment when it dawned on them that things that had seemed so mysterious about body plans and deep structures were all based on this shuffleboard of all of these little HOX genes and the para-HOX genes, they're little cousins that operate in layers as well. We're not yet to the stage where we can work out the proto-HOX cluster, because functionally, when you look at the phylogenies, what you're attempting to do is to work out a set of genetic toolkits that would have been in organisms, all of which are extinct, in forms of life that are not quite like anything you can look at today, because there's literally 1 billion years worth of pileup on top of all of that. And it's not even at all sure what the proto-HOX system would have been doing in an organism that you probably couldn't have seen without a microscope back 1 billion years ago, that might have been playing a kind of minor role in a complex network of bacterial systems in that boring billion period in the time before Ediacara and the Cambrian explosion and all that. So it means it's all done by retroengineering and paleogenomic reconstruction. We're not yet to that stage where they can really get serious about peeling back the superstructures of these things, but
yeah,
it's only a matter of time.
You're right. Yeah, part of the reason is it's the same genes, but regulating different processes in different organisms. And so part of the question is, yes, this gene is ancestral to both of them, but what would it have been doing in their ancestor?
Yeah,
and presumably not the thing that it's doing in either.
We know from way too many cases that the ancestral forms of genes aren't doing what their descendants end up doing, that you have co-opting and eventually a new system kicks in. It's no coincidence also that Sean Carroll titled one of his books, because he's one of the people that's been working on all of this stuff. Although there are 3 different Sean Carrolls. So there's this Sean Carroll A versus the Sean Carroll B versus the Sean Carroll who's a physicist. So anyways, one of the Sean Carrolls. Anyway, he had to have the nod to probably the most beautiful phrase in Darwin: endless forms most beautiful. that all of you think about what HOX genes do if you give it some time. One of his books, because he's look at all the critters around us. That's what we do. I'll take this opportunity, since although we started a bit late, we're still just about at the middle of the thing. So let me jump in and thank the patrons for the program. And yes, indeed, RJ has a patron channel, and there are people, actual living vertebrate organisms in the world of COVID-19 panic, who have continued to actually plunk down money every single month that helps the RJ do things like ink and paper and food and bills. And that is enormously valuable. And I am extraordinarily appreciative of this, especially in the COVID times, because there's so many people that are uncertain about bill paying and stress and all the rest that's going on. So the fact that you've stuck it out and still helping along here. So let me thank our patrons, our, my menu goes here. I hate it when Windows snaps and fills the screen. Our colleagues, Hendril and Eric Rowley and Benjamin Simpson and Speed of Sound and Suris and Zeshi. Our researchers, Travis Adams and Ian Chan, who's ubiquitous, Convert Me, Eat Meal, and James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, nods. Assistant researchers, Doranku and Todas Real, and our friends Daniel and Steve Bauman, our geologist Steve Bauman, Marigale Beddoes, Insects Are Cool, Devin Rand of Reeves, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalovagus, Bo Hobo Roos, Rasmussen, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams. And I will continue to thank, because you helped as well, legacy patrons who haven't been able to keep up all the way to the present, Jan and Jody and Mike and John, Keith, Andrew, Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nanya, Staggles, Sunsky Stone, Ugby Truman, Truths, Everett Vincent, and Sua Weisbaum. Every one of you, I appreciate it enormously. And I will continue to do it as long as I jolly well can. I have to say, just from a personal level, if you had to be in a retirement, it's nice to not be bored to do it. And I'm enjoying the bejabbers out of the work that I'm doing, and the fact that there are people that appreciate the work that I'm doing. I'm trying to tackle a variety of subject matters. You've seen the results already, and the rocks were there. Jackson and I make a really good team, I think, on that. And it's ultimate, it's the bit about source methods. It's the idea that ultimately any argument rests upon a data field. The data field either says what you claim it does, or if it doesn't, then you're not very reliable. So those little fiddly bits, the footnotes, the source referencing, aren't a trivial side issue. And so many of the debates that go on, like the one that Erica was doing with Smokey, is operating at this metaphysical, well, do you accept naturalism? Is your naturalistic assumption preventing you from seeing design? Oh, way before we ever get to that, buckaroo, you've got to pass muster at the source methods level. You got to show that you can clearly think through what you think happened. You got to look through, if you're relying on a secondary source or a technical work, that it's a reliable one, that it's not been outdated by original later research. And you got to play fair with all of that. And the thing that Jackson and I have spotted independently before we teamed up, and the same thing with Pelagia and Diaper Dino and all the other ones in there is a pattern that among anti-evolutionists, holy shit, are they bad scholars? Are they misrepresentatives of source material? Do they avoid awkward information? Do they never work out what they think happened? Do they never apply their model and put it to the test? All of these are fundamental failings of not just anti-evolution. Anti-evolution. Yeah, jump in, Sean.
Yeah. A couple of generations down, of course, you got people who don't even know how to source check. I was one of them myself. Yeah.
I had the advantage of coming in from a completely different discipline. I did not come through the sciences. I have a BA in history. And history is the same issue, even worse. You think scientists get into hissy fit things. If a geologist is arguing over how a particular rock crystal formed, and they can get into some big fits about it, they never have to worry about the idea that the rock crystal is lying to you about itself. But the historian has to deal with propaganda, with memoirs that are self-serving. Caesar's memoirs, for example. Ramesses II, billboards of his vast victories that are like, they're as much propaganda as anything that you would see on a Facebook page or on YouTube today, except they're just made out of stone. And so historians have already had to get into that trick of figuring out, how do you ferret through? Ultimately, you've got to ground it on the facts. And that's why so much of what modern archaeology is about is looking at the stuff you can't worry about lying, what you throw away, what's in the garbage dump, what's on the physical things. How many coins are there? How many, what's the oxygen isotope ratios that suggest whether or not they're eating certain kinds of food or not? The fact that certain kinds of trade goods are showing up, are showing, ergo, that group of people that live here is trading with somebody way up on the Caucasus. All of that doesn't depend on the lying part, you see? And exactly that same principle applies then in the hard sciences, where they don't have to worry about, well, the Andromeda just wants to make us think that it's 1.2 million years old. It's just cheating. No, it doesn't. That doesn't work out that way.
Oh, that's not even getting into it's not even getting into the argument that, oh, God made it look that way to test the faithful.
You know what? I'll tell you, it is a revealing thing how rare it's. That's called the Omphalos argument. I suppose I should type that into the live chat. Everybody Google it. Everybody Google it. The Omphalos argument, which is it's Greek for navel, and it's the issue that was a cutting edge debate in like 1700. When Adam was created by God, did he have a navel? There would have been no umbilical cord. He was zotted out of existence or made from clay, depending on which version of Genesis you read. Why would he have a belly button? And so the idea that what does it mean to create stuff? So that creation with apparent age, that actually was a lot of the argument that was put forward by the young earth creationism of the 1960s, 1970s period. The stuff that a certain amount of that Kent Hovind would have been marinating in as he grew up. But other than some of the brick walls that we're finding in modern creationist apologetics, you don't find that argument very commonly among ICR and AIG and that bunch today. And they want to be sciencey. They figure that the physical forensics...
Everything has to be young. We have to have evidence that it is young. We can't allow any ground.
Oh yeah, they've still got to cover the whole
apostate.
They have to cover the whole field, but they still generally hope that they can shuffle the data field around and support that. Eventually, though, there are boundary layers that they start bumping into the problem. And they get that with accelerated radioactive decay and some of these other boundary layers where they have to start going, well, it just needs a miracle. It was just made that way. And the moment they do that, they're right back at that Omphalos argument. And I would contend that either any anti-evolutionist is going to bog down at the data floor level to the point where they're producing an absolute fog bank of useless glop when they're trying to present what their position is, or they're going to have to just flush it down the toilet with the Omphalos argument and that it was just made that way. And it's fun to see just how far they can go before they have to use the Omphalos argument. Anyway, part two of the show is the usual shtick about, in the course of all the tip research that I do, I encounter new stuff, which either will be something that might go in book 2 of the rocks or other books that we're working on beyond that. And so those things get triaged as to what zone they go into. There's going to be no shortage of projects for us for the next few years. And the fact is that it all connects up with a bigger
for punishment.
Yeah, but it's damn fun. I can tell you, it is so energetically fascinating, partly because you see directly the dregs of human thinking that you go, oh, you really thought to make this kind of an argument? Anyway, one of the ones that I'm not sure whether we'll actually end up in any of the projects or not, but it happened to be one where Michael Flannery, who is one of the ideologues at the Discovery Institute, put up a posting a couple months ago, The Neo-Darwinian Synthesis, a Fable Told by Ernst Mayr.
Oh, Christ.
Yeah. And it's a section that is not very long. I put the link up to it. You can look at it. It's essentially carping about fiddly bit details. And one of the things he brings up is a misleading history, where Ernst Mayr systematically reconstructed a misleading history of evolution, an essentialism story that branded all pre-Darwinian naturalists as reactionary scripture-struck species fixists, despite the fact that this synthesis history bore little resemblance to the truth. There, Flannery starts going off the gangplank with sources he probably should not wanted to have brought up, because in the next sentence down, I gotta read this. In 1931, the supposed nadir of Darwinism, paleontologist Robert Broom found the zoological section of the British Association in London well populated with Darwin enthusiasts at its annual meeting. Did you want to bring up Robert Broom? The guy that predicted the proboscideans, the transitional forms of the reptile mammal transition?
We both know he's not familiar with any part of that, RJ.
Yeah, I doubt actually where Flannery does really know. He was just picking up Broom as that. Well, then he goes on to cite an article, which I put the link up to so that you can read it as well, which is inadvertently way more interesting than I think Flannery wanted it to be, which was a piece from Mark Largent on the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, and it's let me see what the whole, here we go.
They're obsessed with that word, Neo-Darwinism.
Yeah, or Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism. If you look it up, people at the National Center for Science Education have noted that's their go-to word. That,
you know, sorry.
They're much more likely to say this destroys the neo-Darwinian paradigm. This refutes Darwinism. Boogie, boogie, boogie.
It was, I think it was either last week or the week before last that I was reading that article that I sent you. It was like a transcription of a talk between Stephen Meyer and the other guy. The guy who wrote the book Evolution 2.0, which is sort of an intelligent...
Oh gosh, yes, I can't... Perry or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. But anyway, so they were chatting, and Meyer's going on, and I'm reading this, and he keeps saying Neo-Darwinism, Neo-Darwinism. And I was thinking to myself, reading this, it's like, okay, the Neo-Darwinism was the 1940s until... what, 1960s or 70s, until they started realizing neutral theory and evo-devo. And so I kept thinking, why is he using this term? This is not an accurate way to describe the modern synthesis. And then he gets down and says, the modern version of evolution is called Neo-Darwinism because it integrated Mendelian genetics. And I thought, okay, so technically he's using the term correctly. He just thinks the modern evolutionary theory is just natural selection plus Mendelian inheritance, as though this were the 1940s.
Exactly. So, and since none of the people, as in none of the people at the Discovery Institute, are really players on that genetic field, they're just viewing it from the sidelines through their ideological lenses, on whether you're looking at the real players like Andreas Wagner or Sean Carroll or Neil Shubin, or any of the ones that are actually doing the damn work, that they don't, it's as though they're standing right there in front of you watching the new work being done, and yet it just doesn't quite penetrate on there. So the thing about this delightful paper on the so-called eclipse of Darwinism by Largent is that it's a really useful summary of the nitty-gritty details. And he was making a quite valid argument that the cliche view that Bowler and others have done, that Darwinism was in eclipse, that it was shunted to the side, is a bit of an exaggeration. And so this Largent fellow goes through in detail the context of Vernon Kellogg, who pops up in a completely different context in relation to the opposition to the eugenics movement and that occurs later on in the 1920s. But anyway, Vernon Kellogg wrote a book in 1907 on this current state of evolutionary thinking. And it can be fairly said that from their perspective, pretty much the majority opinion was that everything is related by natural common descent and natural selection is a big factor in this. Well, duh, that's Darwinism. It just is that the issue that Vernon Kellogg was worried about at the time, And in retrospect, we know exactly why, is because they didn't know where the origin of variation came from. Well, they didn't know DNA. So of course they don't know what they think. They had no idea of genetics. And even that bunch in the Neo-Darwinian synthesis era that now put in Mendelian genetics, they didn't know about DNA yet either.
Yeah. So it was the structure, wouldn't be figured out till the 50s, which was 10 years after.
And not until the 60s that they figured out what coded for what. So then it's like Kid in the Candy Store. So now modern evolutionary biology is a bit more than the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, because now it has layers on layers because of those homeobox genes that you have. I'll put this in the layer cake approach. You've got your structural genes that produce proteins. That's actually a pretty small chunk, and how much of a small chunk depends on the organism, because some generate big swaths of additional material and have way more proteins than they have genes, as in our case.
RJ, do you think it'd be fair to say, if it's like they're looking at general relativity and they're saying this doesn't fit with Newtonian dynamics? Well,
yes, of course. And after all, why, I can't get on my bicycle and test this relativity theory now, can I?
It's a little funny that they're putting the new discoveries in terms of models that were invented decades and decades ago, and they're acting as though nothing has changed in all the decades.
There's an awful lot of banging the dead horse over this, and that's another reason why, if you look at apologetics that's still screaming bloody murder over Stephen Jay Gould versus Maynard Smith back in 1975. I mean, you go, yipes. just let it go. Anyway,
they're all dead now.
So you've got your protein coding genes, and then you have these regulatory genes that are turning them on and off, and then you have these homeobox genes, master planner genes, and the turning of them on and off. And then, of course, one of the latest buzzwords that the intelligent design movement has latched onto, epigenetics. The bunch over in John Maddox's network, there's a whole bunch of people
trust.
in that. They're just going, ooh, epigenetics. I'm terribly sorry. Those systems are developed in part as a way to compensate parasitical systems and the like. I had a whole section on it in, I think, tip 1.5 at my website, because the design movement was starting to riff off of this. So I pointed out some of the backgrounds of why, no, it's not really anti-evolutionary. It's just a different layer.
Yeah, and I mean, we discussed epigenetics a little bit in Rocks because Georgia Purdom brought it up.
Yeah.
But nothing about this is weird or anti-evolutionary. It's just another aspect.
If I'm not remembering correctly, but isn't Georgia Purdom part of AIG?
Yep.
Yeah, we discussed it.
She was bringing it up and should know better because she has a bloody genetics degree.
It's funny that
they were trying to, or she was trying to bring it up as a sort of like neo-Lamarckism, which it kind of isn't.
Yeah, and to some extent, even Lamarck wasn't a Lamarckian. But I suppose just for the historical purposes, everyone metaphorically raise your hand if you have the foggiest idea who the hell Lamarck was. Lamarck was somebody about a generation earlier than Darwin. And it's associated with the by your bootstraps inheritance of acquired characteristics. So the idea that if you exercise your muscles real strong, your kids will inherit the strong muscles you have. And there was a flirtation with that as a potential drive mechanism for evolutionary change. It suffers from the tiny problem that it's impossible.
It really doesn't work.
Right. And in fact, if you want to hear somebody excoriate over Lamarck, just read Richard Dawkins and his
read anything by Richard Dawkins.
Yeah,
any of his books. Like I think all of his books have a section dedicated to just frying Lamarck.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And but I think Dawkins makes a valid point.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
A more general notion is if you have a replicator that can have inherited characteristics and can pass those on to its descendants, and those variations can affect reproduction and success, you have a Darwinian replicator. Bingo. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no way to avoid it. It's going to happen. Live with it. Get on with it. Move on.
It
won't be a Lamarckian one. It can't be a Lamarckian one. Lamarckianism in principle is going to collapse.
There are some aspects of epigenetics that seem sort of Lamarckism, because there, in very rare cases, certain events can be transferred from the parent to offspring. However, they usually don't go on, I think, beyond one generation.
Yeah,
so even
they're
if
very
it is
transitory. They have some effect, and I heard a lecture on this at one of the EWU Darwin days a couple years back, that they can actually have a role in speciation processes, that can have an effect as well. So it's not as though it's a trivial thing,
right?
But it's not anti-Darwinian. And the fact that intelligent designers like to think, and whenever you get this new layer, it was the same thing with Standing for Truth and his obsessions with the 4D genome and that kind of stuff that you get into. There's yet another layer of interconnection. For one thing, for example, the simple shape of the DNA, that genes are often in clustered arrangements. And so the things that interact with them are interacting with the stuff that's adjacent to it. And so there's a network of things, and that some genes, what's unusual is when connections can occur that can link up to things that are kind of way down the train. So it's like thinking of a train set where the tracks get really coiled together, and you can have connections between stuff at this siding and the stuff over there next to the watering tower in ways that get connected and relating to evolutionary change that way. So yeah, that can get rather complicated and intricate. Well, all the design person has to do is say, well, look at that. It's complicated. It must be intentional and designed. To which I tend to want to look at, what does it do? And so you discover the extent to which these things can lead to diseases and problems that can lead to glitches. And
I would argue the exact opposite. I would say if it is ridiculously complex, that argues precisely against a designer. If you if you need to transfer some signal molecule across a cell, and the only way to do it is by activating 5 different proteins. You activate one, which goes slightly over activates one, which activates one. Why? What is the point of doing this bit by bit by bit process? If you're an intelligent designer, you've created everything, the entire universe, you can't make one little protein to go from here to here?
Yeah.
Why does it have to go?
It's as though it's the same problem. If you're familiar with the old Rube Goldberg pictures, there's a whole bunch of people that still riff off of it, and it's just delightful, of having an overly complicated machine to do a simple thing, to where it involves stuff that's things climbing up things and knocking over stuff, and and every once in a while somebody will do a little stick on that. There was one on this comedy channel where the fellow was showing this fantastically elaborate thing to trap a cat that was exactly that. It involved just intricate layers of towels dropping onto things and knocking over the stuff, and still he missed the cat. The cat just looked up and jumped out of the way before the box came down. But the whole bit about this bad design element is, it's, to put it into a nutshell, it's as if you designed a cog that works beautifully as a cog, but occasionally it bursts into flames. So you have to have another system that pours water on the cog periodically to keep it from bursting into flames. But then the water fills up to the point where the cog won't work inside the thing. So you have to have another thing that periodically opens up the drain to keep that from where. Well, why not just make a gear that doesn't burst into flames,
Yeah, that would be a lot easier.
Yeah.
But no, or I think our eyes are one of the really good examples of that, because creationists are always going on about how complex our eyes are. Well, light has to pass over, our optic nerve to hit the photoreceptors at the back of the eye. That's not very intelligent. Yeah, it's like the analogy is installing a camera backwards.
Yeah. And the thing is that when you imagine living organisms that can do their thing, they've got eyeballs, a problematic early eyeball, but it's better than no eyeball at all. Now you have a system of things that, in that seething interaction of molecular systems, develop compensatory mechanisms. And it's no coincidence that when you look at any particular compensatory mechanism in detail, which they gradually start doing, you discover that there's a range of compensatory mechanisms, that some of them work more in one organism, less in another, slightly different way over here than over here. That looks exactly like you would expect from another word to look up here or to make use of. It's not used all that commonly, but it's one that pops up in some of the things, a kludge. A C-L-U-G-E. I know Daniel Dennett is fond of making use of it. It's the idea that something is kind of clumsy, but it works. I can use a design example. The reason why we have internal combustion engines designed the way they are. It's not that you can't design varying different ways of having internal combustion. There are Stirling cycles and Wankels. There's a whole bunch of wonderful, clever systems, many of which are more efficient than the ones we use in our cars. But they've got trade-offs. So what it ends up, the reason why the internal combustion engine remains such a stalwart is because it's fairly durable. It's relatively forgiving of things. Wankel engines are just hellaciously precise. If they get even tiny bits out of alignment, they can get gummed up. And so there's the idea that some things can be beautifully elegant and magnificent and vulnerable. It's the difference between American style jets and Russian jets. The Russians build them kind of kludgy and clumsy, but workable and cheap so that they can turn them out. And who cares if the guy crashes? They're just working for the fatherland.
I got the perfect name for that you're describing. It's called Awesome But Impractical.
Yes. They. A weird sidelight. I was just studying up on the efforts to design aerodynamic ocean liners. Norman Bell Geddes, the modernist designer, designed a completely aerodynamic ocean liner that nobody ever built. And that for one thing, because aerodynamic drag for a thing the size of the Titanic really doesn't matter, that it's a relatively trivial detail. You're not going fast enough to matter, for the same reason that you don't usually put spoilers on your tricycle, because you're never getting up to sufficient speed to really bother about that, unless you just want to impress yourselves and put up a little spoiler on there. You know that a car that's got a mechanically powered, computer-controlled spoiler system probably has a really spectacular engine and bad gas mileage and a driver who has reached a midlife crisis.
Yeah, probably.
Well, I'd try it just to see how fast I could go.
But you're a dangerous little fellow, Tornado. So what we can expect that.
I mean, that is the quote bad design argument. You know, why would you have to design it this way, or why would a designer have to design it?
And that's where the phylogeny and contingency comes into the fact. The recurrent laryngeal nerve being a spectacular example, that it's not a problem. And it's a perfectly reasonable layout in a fish with a short neck. But as the organism can only deal with what it builds on, and that's one of the reasons why it was such a puzzlement for certain kinds of systems as to how they evolve.
But if you're a sauropod,
you can't
with
have
a 40-foot
design
neck.
fixes. You can't abruptly shift from one to another. So a thing that's inheriting the system from its previous biology is stuck with all the pieces. So if the thing goes down to here, connected to that bone, fine and dandy. And as the bone shifts and gets longer and changes, it's still got to do that. So the thing can finally morph around to the point where now it's a really awkward problem that if you had designed it right from scratch, you could have avoided that without difficulty.
As you said, if you're a fish, it's fine. If you're, super saurus with a 45-foot neck, suddenly you've got a 90-foot nerve.
And you can't get around it. So that's why the phylogeny of things, one of the subjects that will be put into volume 2 is a subject that I don't think we brought up in volume 1, which was the bombardier beetle. And it happens to be that it pops up again in this Institute for Creation Research example of the supposed, Joel Duff just did a magnificent, and now I'm going to have to read through that. He's just done a wonderful study over at Naturalis Historia on creationist misrepresentations of the bombardier beetle. But Dwayne Gish had brought it up.
Numerous.
Gish had brought it up back in the 1960s as a way to, he brought up fire-breathing dinosaurs. And then use that as a way to bring up, well, there's bombardier beetle, so why couldn't there be like a fire-breathing dinosaur? Okay.
When you're even bad at your own field.
Yes, exactly. Well, and
those
because
things are in some of the popular books too.
oh, yeah,
my dad's read both of those.
and it still pops up in the creationist literature, which is why it's still a trope. The funky thing about it is, even I had done some study on it for my old tip project, and I'll be folding that stuff in as well. But Duff, as usual, has done a much more detailed thing, and we'll give him the nod for the detailed work on it. But that there's a phylogenetic distribution of these pygidial glands and these components in these. It's not a bombardier beetle. There's a whole variation of them, and they get into a problem because they're not closely related to each other. A lot of these things have developed convergently in a variety of different lineages, which of course begs the question, how many kinds of beetle are there?
Yes. As we said in Rocks Volume 1, the beetle family, the road beetle, Staphylinidae, has, 30,000 members? So we're talking 30,000 members in 4,500 years. Oops.
That is more than all ant species.
Yeah.
There's only 20,000 species of ants.
But yeah, you're talking about thousands of species per year, so. And
needless to say, if anybody wants to take a life or death bet that you will ever see creationists work out the baraminology of beetles, don't take
sucker bets.
I want to see how many would actually fit on the ark if they were, two of each.
No, they avoid insects like the plague. And obvious things, did they actually invite wood-boring insects onto the ark? Was this a good idea? How many termites were there? But the problem with so many insects is they don't take well to being drowned. So although there are some organisms that can handle that, most of them can't. So you find it's one of those big cricket moments ironically, in the creationist literature that they don't discuss this matter. That insects don't come up very often unless it's to go, gee whiz, look at the clever bombardier beetle. But not how did the bombardier beetle fare during the flood? Or did they just squirt out their stuff in anger?
What about all the freshwater arthropods? What happened to them?
Yeah, and let alone all the fossil arthropods that show a great like those giant eurypterids and all that from previous periods, Carboniferous and all that. What the hell were they doing?
Where'd all the trilobites go?
The animals that don't.
Yeah, what did the trilobites ever do to God to go extinct?
They existed.
Yeah, poor little
Although he
things.
made them, sorry.
Perhaps they became haughty with their schizochroial eyes.
Yeah, some of them said, maybe I'll go on to land.
Here's one that this popped up as well in that Kent Hovind thing. Kent Hovind trots out some stuff in his older material he doesn't do anymore, and you'll instantly know why when I repeat it. He argues that because of the ice canopy snowball-y thing that was in the heavens, that layer of water amplified sound, so Adam could hear the heavens.
Because that's how sound works. Tornado, is that how sound works?
No!
I didn't think so.
A fucking horn.
Tornado has detected a problem in that argument.
Numerous errors have been detected.
It made it brighter as well, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and Kent was prone to this kind of stuff in the older material. And then once in a while, he'll trope back to it, like that bit about the Archaeopteryx hoax that he trotted back out in 2018.
Which is just hilarious because, for one thing, I think Erica should definitely do a video about that, because the Sediba, Australopithecus sediba and Homo habilis are, according to Standing, fake. They're not real. They're artificial because they're too transitional. The same is true of Archaeopteryx. It's too transitional. It's not quite bird and it's not quite theropod. It's perfectly right in the split. And now we don't just have one Archaeopteryx. We have 13 specimens of Archaeopteryx.
Oh, yeah. Back in the 1980s.
And we also have
Back in the 1980s, when this
On
hoax theory was
Archaeopteryx?
put out, it was there were way fewer Archaeopteryxes, although they specifically only dealt with the London specimen, either the London or Berlin specimen, one of the two. But the point is that since the 1980s, a whole bunch of new ones have been found. In one case, one that is sufficiently different from the standard Archaeopteryx that it's been classified as a separate species.
Yeah, and now we have not just them, but other near birds. We have the whole group of the Anchiornithines, which are all so similar to birds that they've all been within avialae at one point, and they've all been kind of moved. Okay, maybe they're not quite, maybe they're sister, or maybe just a little bit slightly out further. And different different dromaeosaurs and troodontids have been considered maybe they're birds, maybe not. And so it's really hard
precisely
for the
because everything is so remarkably similar that the amount of anatomical shifts to get from a standard theropod dinosaur to a bird is minor tweaking. And once they discovered, but this is another one where I, as an old fart, have a different perspective than younger people, because virtually anybody that's younger than 25 literally will never have lived at a time when they didn't know that there were feathers on dinosaurs. Whereas all of that came along in my time frame, that this was an unsettled question when I was just starting up the project and they were just beginning to find some more of these little indications. Well, now we have a bloody glut. We listed 35 genera of feathered theropods in rocks were there. And these were all ones we left out every single one that was just inferential. So for example, if you would know that a particular species, its cousin apparently has feathers in that group, well, but we didn't even include those. We included those that explicitly had feather impressions and feather nodes. And that was 35 bloody genera.
Which, according to David Minton, because they've gone full fiducia now, they must all have been birds, including
all birds, flightless birds.
Or not Nano-Tyrannus, Eutyrannus, sorry.
Yeah. And about the only outlier here, and once in a while you might find somebody, and this would be a litmus test if you encounter it, somebody that's riffing off of the old Pandas and People book. It was kind of waffly and tried to kind of argue that Archaeopteryx was just a reptile that wasn't really a bird.
That's funny, because that's what some of the earliest anatomists who looked at Archaeopteryx kind of argued about it. So that's very funny.
Oh, well, and remember that most of the early Archaeopteryx fossils that were found had such faint feather impressions that they were not identified as a bird.
Well, yeah, I found a quote. I can't remember his name, but he said it's a quote from a guy in like 1875, I think. And he says,
Heilman, maybe?
Which one? Heilman?
Heilman. He was a big bird guy.
I don't think it was Heilman. Yeah, because he wrote Origin of Birds, but I don't think it was Heilman. But regardless, this person says, while some of the great anatomists have considered that maybe Archaeopteryx is just a strange reptile, most consider it a bird. And I was like, that's just so funny, because these people who were around before young Earth creationism, this is kind of the very origin of evolution.
Yeah, they're just looking at the facts.
And they're like, maybe it's a weird lizard. Maybe it's
and look at it. It's instructive if you ever want to dive into it, to look at the exchanges that went back and forth between Julian Huxley and Owen over the dinosaurian nature.
And if you really want to have some fun, bear in mind that when they say that the Archaeopteryx is too transitional and therefore it must be fake, they're effectively shooting themselves in the foot by admitting, yes, it's a transitional form.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the same problem they get into at the reptile-mammal transition. Philip Johnson, it took exactly that argument. Well, you can't prove anything with this reptile-mammal transition because there are so many transitional forms, you can't tell which one was the real one or not.
Big yikes.
It's like, so you're going to accept that the reptile-mammal transition has transitional forms.
Yeah, and so I would like to have asked, Johnson, of course, is dead now, so but I did try to get him to answer, what is the correct number of transitional forms to satisfy you? Obviously, you want to have more than one, but if you have like 5 or 6, is that too many?
Yeah, no, it's
And of
it's
course,
too many.
I like how they always parade out, oh, you'll never find a transitional form because they don't exist. And then, oh, there's too many transitional forms, or this is too transitional, therefore it's fake and the real one doesn't exist.
Meanwhile, our
You need more
Jensen,
transitionals between the transitions.
our Jensen guy is one of those who has set the new goalpost moving, because he's the one who just a couple years ago said, oh, we creationists have always accepted transitional forms.
Big oof.
Anyway,
That's what you call a lie.
oh, Travis Adams says it's a bizzard between.
I'm trying to see if I can find that quote. It was such a good quote.
Or a binosaur. There we go. But yeah, I, as a dinosaur groupie, am just thrilled with how much is known about that. And so that whole period where we still have relatively little before Archaeopteryx, but we've got a sure as hell lot after that. So now it ranges up to the interesting questions of why didn't more of the birds make it through the KT extinction? Only the ornithines made it through. None of the anti-ornithines, the ones that were once the dominant group, which then brings up the idea that something that has a relatively minor niche that turns out to be the lucky niche actually acts as a survival clue, whereas the ones that didn't go into that niche, they dominated all the other ones, where now that's a disadvantage, they check out. And so that's kind of indicating the upper level. Sean is putting up the link to Gut Six Gibbons. I would have liked to have heard the rest of what Smokey is going to do for the rest of the show.
Yeah.
You're right. Smokey
I doubt Smokey. I'll make a prediction, and if anybody sees it before I do, they can test out whether or not this is true or not. That at the end of the show, you will know no more about what Smokey thinks about anything than at the beginning of the show. That you'll still have no clue about any of the known fossil hominids and their interconnections as to what they did and when anything happened at all. And that's another reason why Map of Time is an issue I want more people to pay attention to regarding anti-evolutionists, because it's a universal screw up among anti-evolutionists. I'm not being hyperbolic here. Literally, nobody in the anti-evolution department thinks through of this happened and this happened in a temporal framework. Young Earth creationists are in their constrained frame, but they don't think that through. And the old Earth creationists and intelligent designers have the widescreen super chronology, but they don't think it through either. Jackson knows from reading all of that Steve Meyer stuff, there is no time when he thinks through, what does he think happened? What's the sequencing of the designs?
Yeah, no, they will never tell you. And I think it would be very helpful, very revealing if they would make us a list, because it seems like nothing could have ever evolved. They're not even allowing variations on anything. Yeah. So my question
nothing is related to anything.
Can they just make us a list maybe of groups? Like, what is the largest set of clades that you think are related by natural selection and common descent? What is the largest group? And then just
none. They all have to be created.
And especially Behe or Denton, who theoretically accept common descent.
Exactly.
And yet you never get that. And that's how a Steve Meyer can do a paper with not one but two young Earth creationists, and chronology never comes up in it. Easy, boop, because neither one of them are thinking about chronology. They're thinking entirely. This Smokey was bringing up. You'll be shocked to hear this, Jackson. Where did the information come from for the human beings?
Damn it.
Where did the DNA come from? Which, of course, is all irrelevant. That's billions of years before the hominids arrived. And that's another part of that map of time problem, is that instead of figuring out that when you're talking about hominid origins, even in a design context, there would have been a magic creation event sometime earlier. Now you've got organisms going around. You've got primates, early Australopithecines. Now, what exactly is happening? Are there design events? What do those design events look like? What do they involve? That's the level at which your argument would need to operate. But instead, it's where did information and DNA come from? It's irrelevant. You don't have to figure out where sexual reproduction developed. You don't have to worry about homeobox genes, any of those nuts and bolts in it. All of that's way earlier. And so that urge to go back to origins or bust, don't bother me with what we can see, and don't ask me to explain any of this. You have to do all the work. You evolutionists have to explain everything. And when you try to explain anything, we'll give it the middle finger by saying, well, what about this? And what about that before that? And what about that? And that's the sum total of anti-evolution apologetics.
And if you don't have an answer for any of this, you have to admit that it was created. Theirs
is the default option. And sorry, that's not how science or any field works. It would be as if an example I like to give in historical terms is in what language did Caesar and Cleopatra boink? We know that Caesar spoke Latin and Greek. We know, according to the records, that Cleopatra spoke Greek, but apparently didn't know Latin, although I would be surprised if she didn't know a few fornication terms and swear words from it. But she could speak Hebrew. She could speak Syrian. She was the first of the pharaohs, the Ptolemies, to actually be able to speak Egyptian. She was a smart-ass one. That she had like 7 or 8 languages, but Latin was not one of them. So reasonably, we would infer most likely when they were whispering sweet nothings in their ears, if they did, it would be in Greek. We can be absolutely certain it was not in Mayan or conversational Klingon or some other bit of Elvish. We can be absolutely certain of that without ever being able to do recordings or have any documentation. Those are ruled out. And the problem is that the creation model is in the role of the Klingon option. Anyway, I think we probably overstayed our welcome. We're past an hour. As the young visitor to the group, Sean, do you have any last minute comments or things to say about our happy show?
Can I say what I'm working on at the moment?
Oh, absolutely. Give a shameless plug, Sean.
Oh yeah, I haven't yet sent up my YouTube things, but I'm going to be working on an educational thing for children, or science classes, because obviously we need to get some education out to the kids because they're not getting it at school. And yeah, and I'm working on the book that. Yeah,
so basically we're all keeping busy. And
yes.
And the idea is to keep busy in a way that actually adds to things rather than subtracts. And the problem is that I fear the Smokies of the world aren't adding anything. But meanwhile, Erica is probably going to be, first of all, she's way more personable than I am. Not more personable than you are, Jackson, but nevertheless more personable than I am. And so I would be expecting that there are probably going to be some people, hopefully, that will be watching those debates and start sparking to think, maybe I should look into that. Let's kind of find out about that. Whereas I suspect Smokey will not actually convey much information, that the only ones he's appealing to are people who are just reinforcing the tropes and will say, oh, he really did a wonderful job saying what I want to be true. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I don't want to know what I want to be true. I want to know what actually is true and have a method that's rigorous enough that I can figure out if I've got it wrong or right. And that's where source methods comes in. So there is the continual banging the drum, source methods. And anyway, see you all, gang. Thanks again to Scientist Mel, who pulls out the stops because she's got like an education thing on her plate that she has to take time out from a busy, hectic, nervous world of interacting with young people in the educational field in college. So I will always appreciate the fact that you've been able to help us here, Scientist Mel.
I'm happy to do it. Pull the plug
on us.
Thanks, Mel.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a great night, guys.
Yep. Everybody stay safe. See you next week. I agree, Old Scratch. Erica is going to be an amazing primatologist. She's going to be a live wire. I think she'll be an excellent educator.
Now, of course, apologize if I'm not as good as this course on this.
It's a thing you just learn over time, and it's applied curiosity. It's the simplest questions we